Good morning, everyone. Buenos dias. Bonjour. I hope you're all feeling energized on our second day of the conference. It's been great so far. I'm happy to see many familiar faces in the room, but also many new ones. I'm pretty excited to be here today and also joined by two wonderful colleagues now, it feels like. Unfortunately, as you can see, we only have three of us on stage. We have one of our speakers will not be able to join us in this panel, but we did hear from him. We did hear from Patrick already. I do hope that you had the chance to hear him out yesterday during that panel, or you had the chance to connect with him throughout the conference. So before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather today is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Till this day, this meeting place is home to many Indigenous people across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to be living and working on this land. So my name is Eugenia Ochoa. I'm the Public Engagement Coordinator with the Ontario Council for International Cooperation, OCIC. And I'm delighted, really, to be joined today by two powerful and very diverse leaders in our sector and international partners as well. In my work with OCIC, we know the importance of multisectoral dialogue to better understand and encourage expertise, resources, and leverage these things to understand good practice. So I think unique moments like this one, where we have international partners and Canadian partners bringing together their perspectives, is quite a special one. And our hope for today is that we can deepen our engagement and gain some insights on advancing equitable gender norms and gender equality globally, and also some lessons learned for Canada. So I think throughout this conference, we've learned a lot about what's happening globally, shifts that are broadly changing the way we think, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, that have brought in new complexities, but also I think we've heard that they bring opportunities too, to think a bit differently, to think innovatively, and that are pushing us to think about universality and what does that mean in our context. We've also heard about national shifts, such as the Feminist International Assistance Policy, throughout the conference, and what implications that brings to us, to the sector, to the work we do. Also, we'll be able to hear about perspectives for international partners that understand these shifts, these frameworks, and maybe are doing very similar things in their work as well. And finally, I think we are being called to truly work on our reconciliation process here in Canada, and move the needle in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission 94 calls to action. And how is that going to look in our work and broadly in our lives as well? So, given this context, I'd actually like to pose the first question, not to our panelists, but to you. With a show of hands, let me see who considers themselves innovative in this room. All right. Good, good, good. That's fantastic. That's great. We need innovators. We've heard that time and time again. I wish I saw everybody put their hands up, but we're going to do a little exercise. I want you to think or consider, if we get to 2030, if we get to that deadline, what does SDG 5, what does it look like? If we get to 2030, and if we're ambitious, what does that look like? Write it down in front of you on a piece of paper, tweet it out to the world, and we'll come back to this question in just a second. So now it's time to hear from our panelists, and I'll introduce them first so you get a little bit of a sense of who they are, what they do, their work, and then I'll pass on the mic to them. So our first speaker is Jean-Pierre Zilli. He's a technical advisor for Save the Children Canada. And for the past 13 years, he has been providing technical assistance in SRH and HIV/AIDS programming. And he does this by piloting models of delivering family planning services in schools and different community platforms such as TV and radio, which is very interesting. And I think you're also working with youth across Southern Africa as well. Alimatu Demonekene is an award-winning human rights activist and founder of Project ACI, and which we'll hear about shortly. She is a leading advocate for women, and she has advised the UK government and many other agencies on issues such as tackling domestic violence, especially its linked to the mental well-being of women and girls. And in the last day or so, I've really been witness to what she does especially well, which is bringing together people, making connections, and opening up platforms to exchange, learn from each other, and really build this community around the world with a mission to end violence against women and girls globally. So I think we're in for a pretty good conversation. And first of all, I've asked our panelists to tell us a little bit about their work and consider a few things as they do so. So the first one is what makes their work gender responsive versus gender transformative. So what are those things that they're working on that we can learn from are a little bit more transformative, systemic. Also, considering the SDGs call to action about leaving no one behind, I want to hear a little bit more about intersectionality and how they address that in their work. And thirdly, and finally, I want to hear about some non-negotiable components that we must address in order to achieve gender equality and power on in gender norms as well. So our first speaker is Jean-Pierre, so I'll leave you to it.
Great. Hello, everyone. Bonjour, goeiemorgen, if you're from South Africa like I am. Raise your hand if being called a health expert makes you nervous. I know it does when I get called that, but let me go ahead. So today I'm going to be talking about our Growing Up Great project, or Beyond2020, as it's called in French, and it talks about transforming gender norms as part of early adolescence. So Save the Children's working with an upstream approach and building positive gender norms starting from early adolescence, and why this is such a critical and pivotal time in personal development. I'm going to highlight a USAID-funded project that we're running currently in Kinshasa, and then talk about the scale-up that we're going to be doing with the GAC funding starting from this year. So why do we focus on early adolescence? Well, the entire period of adolescence, while only about a decade long, has a huge, huge span of human development built into it. And this makes it very difficult to target as a single demographic. This is why within Save the Children, we break it down into an age and life stage approach. So we first focus on what we call very young adolescents, or VYAs, as I'll call them throughout the presentation, which is from 10 to 14 years old, and then older adolescents, which is from 15 to 19. So very young adolescents, or VYAs, make up about 600 million globally, with only 90% of them living in low and middle income countries. Unfortunately, this age group is neglected in most health policies and programs, many instead targeting children under 5 for obvious health reasons, and then older adolescents from 15 and older. Very young adolescents, as we're saying, making up 90% in low and middle income countries, aren't targeted. According to early findings that came out of the Global Early Adolescence Study in September, run by Robert Bloom at Johns Hopkins, he came forward saying that gender norms are instilled by age 10. So that means that any programming that we're doing perhaps from 15 onwards is missing out on this very critical time and perhaps might be too late. So what do? Let's look forward, let's look at very young adolescents. Very young adolescents themselves face very unique challenges. During this critical transition period, we see a number of biological, cognitive, and social emotional changes, making it a very important window of opportunity, and I outlined more on the slide over there. They're transitioning into new roles in society. They're facing expectations that they will act like men and women rather than children. One of the major elements of development that happens during early adolescence is the formation of social norms, rules that govern our behavior, what we believe other people do, and what other people believe we should do. Therefore, social norm development will vary based on the social environment surrounding them, their family, their friends, their community, their school, and beyond. And we're going to explore that in this presentation. So to address the needs of young people during this critical period, Save the Children has put together an approach, our very young adolescent approach. And I'm just going to run through some basic steps. We've incorporated different elements with the overall objective of building a foundation for gender equitable practices and the use of health services as adolescents transition into adulthood and start to take up health services for the first time, starting with contraception and working their way through different family planning modes. Our very young adolescent programs use a social economical approach, which engages the multiple spheres of influence to shape their transition into later adolescence and adulthood. This includes activities with their parents, adult caregivers, the teachers, their school, their community, and trying to foster linkages further into the health system. Because gender norms and social norms are formed during this period, we encourage the formation of positive gender norms that support equitable roles for men and women, for boys and girls. We focus on comprehensive sexuality education, making sure that VYAs receive age-appropriate information about puberty, fertility, and contraception. So again, programming for an 11-year-old is very different from programming for a 17-year-old when it comes to topics such as puberty and fertility. We use captivating, interactive methods to engage very young adolescents, including games and stories. And in line with the FIAP, we understand the critical value of building local capacity. All our programming that we put forward is done through local partners, building that capacity. We don't do direct implementation ourselves. So really working around CBOs, school structures, and trying to build it into the local curriculums. Dr. Chandra Muli of the WHO published a paper in 2015 outlining ineffective health programming approaches for adolescents that are still being used. And he focuses on 3 core elements: youth centers, peer-to-peer education, and what was the third one? High-profile meetings on ASRHR. He says that all of these have been shown as ineffective in changing ASRHR health knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. So these are the type of findings that we really try and incorporate into our work to make sure that we aren't making the same mistakes, and hopefully there's an innovative piece within that. So how is this approach being implemented? I'm going to outline a bit of the toolkit that we use within the Beyond2020 project currently being run in Kinshasa. The big question: does an intervention for early adolescence that addresses gender norms, gender-based violence, and sexual and reproductive health lead to more equitable gender roles, delayed sexual debut and pregnancy, and increased family planning over the adolescent life course? Quite a loaded question, quite a big thing to test. Growing Up Great, again, applies a socio-ecological approach that acknowledges the many actors who play a role in forming the attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors of the very young adolescents. This intervention aims to influence change at each one of these lessons, and I'm going to work through a few of the components. Firstly, focusing on the individual. We've established mixed sex groups that use a set of interactive materials to discuss and reflect norms regarding gender. We directly engage boys and girls through clubs based in schools, and then reach out to very young adolescents who are not in schools through their community with very mapping tools that we set out. The tools explore puberty, menstruation, changing gender norms, expectations, relationships, and they run these surrealistic stories that are really meant to engage participants in similar environments. We also recognize our parents are involved in shaping the perceptions and behaviors of very young adolescents. Again, findings from the Global Early Adolescent Study points to the household being one of the most integral parts of reaching very young adolescents. This is something we know, and I think that from a programming point of view, can actually be the hardest layer to actually involve. It's much easier to perhaps reach out to the community, to go through the schools, to go through community clubs, than it is to actually engage the household itself. We've developed a set of video testimonials that feature parents from these same neighborhoods who have adopted these positive behaviors, who are trying to influence some other parents to come and take part to see what is involved within these discussions. We've also worked with school leadership and teachers to incorporate these materials into their classrooms and instruction alongside the National Family Curriculum. So again, as a sustainability piece, really trying to incorporate this into the family life stage curriculum. We also recognize that many young adolescents are not sexually active yet and have limited access to health services. Given this, we're still challenging those norms related to the youth of services by building linkages to the health system. So we set up visits where health providers go to the schools, they give lessons, they get to know the students, and in the same way, the varying adolescents are able to come to the schools and able to see what the environment is about. Many of those VYs haven't actually been to a health facility up until this point, and it's going to be a journey that they're going to have going forward. And again, this intervention was designed to be as simple as scalable as possible. So activities are implemented all locally, or by local partners. School group sessions, again, are facilitated by very young adolescents themselves or by teachers. Over the last 6 months, the team tested this intervention in 40 schools during a pilot to learn about and refine their approach. This includes a qualitative evaluation led by Georgetown Institute of Reproductive Health. And this has formed part of the larger Passages project that brings in global research from a dozen projects forward. So it's really part of a larger piece of the puzzle, which is quite exciting. And this was designed to shape our research agenda and find out what the challenges were. So were there challenges? You betcha. Let's go into some of them. First, we looked at school enrollment among very young adolescents in these supported areas. Very, very hard age group to reach. Firstly, because 10 to 12 might be in primary school, but 13 to 14 are in high schools. That means you can't reach them as a homogeneous group in a single school setting. In the same way, the enrollment within these schools can be quite fluid. Many very young adolescents might drop out due to lack of money for school fees within the DRC context. Many might have to drop out to help at home or help with a job. There are others who move schools because their parents are perhaps moving for migrational work as well. So you can understand that across these grades, you'll have a variety of age groups, and some 13 to 14-year-olds might be in very young grades as it is. There's also the perception that with some parents enrolling their kids early gives them an advantage in the school year. So we also have very young students that are in older grades, and much of the material isn't actually appropriate for them yet. Another challenge with implementing these schools is over-enrollment. Often these schools are operating 3 different school days in one, so morning, afternoon, and after school, trying to go through the whole curriculum. This, apart from overstretching the resources and making for very tired teachers, limits our ability to do after-school activities. And again, means that we have to be more flexible with how we implement this going forward. We also struggle to identify CBOs with expertise working with this cohort and with expertise working in sexual reproductive health. So while we're relying on this local capacity, does the local capacity actually exist in these places? And that has to be built up. So the team learned a lot in this pilot period, which heavily influenced our GAC project design going forward. This brings us to scaling up. We've just started this new project called Beyond2020 that allows us to increase our saturation in existing districts and expand to new ones. Most importantly, this GFSC funding allows us to build on our work to also include older adolescents. Social normative change can't be limited to just working with very young adolescents. Despite the large window of opportunity, it has to be continued onwards to the older cohort as part of a comprehensive approach. The ability to scale up also allows us to incorporate a few key lessons that we've learned, and very briefly I'll outline a few of them. Firstly, we need to encourage participation of girls and very young adolescents on an ongoing basis. We found that certain individuals tend to dominate the sessions, and it largely tends to be boys, so really pulling on that piece. We also need to engage parents prior to starting these sessions. So a large part of getting consent worked quite well because parents just signed off, not really understanding the curriculum until the kids started coming home with materials and parents started actually looking through what they were bringing home, and we had a few pulled from the program. And doing this onward engagement with parents was quite important because also, despite having the buy-in from their side, it also involved them perhaps in the sessions going forward. So that other layer of the socio-ecological model that we're trying to pull them into. We also found, probably most importantly, we have to have multiple channels to inform parents, including varying the time of the sessions, be able to accommodate their schedules, especially from the male participation component. We had many fathers that worked on the other side of Kinshasa, had to sit in traffic, had to work long hours, and if we're just doing a 2-hour window to meet with parents on a Monday afternoon or on a Saturday morning, that's not good enough. And I think as part of our programming, if we want to take that seriously, we have to be more flexible from our side as well. We also have to ensure that providers are prepared to do these health exchange visits. You can imagine you go to a health provider and tell them you're going to bring some very young adolescents into their facility. Some of their jaws might drop to the ground. So really making sure that they've got the capacity to be able to do this, to be able to run these sessions on top of their workload as well. Otherwise, we're overstretching the health system. So a large part was trying to identify providers who perhaps wanted to be able to earn a little bit of extra cash on their days off, and then being able to identify health facilities themselves that were appropriate, that had the adolescent-friendly services in place. They were clean. They really reflected what we wanted them to see in the health system. We also found there was meaningful at community level to invite opinion leaders and respected community members to help increase the reach. So really to involve them in the mapping process, to help them to really understand the complexities of why at community level we weren't able to perhaps target the most vulnerable or the hardest to reach, which was our mandate under this funding. So in closing, I just want to highlight 2 final points that I really think are good to take home. So firstly, be intentional in your engagement of stakeholders. An important decision we made was to invite key holders to be active participants from the very beginning. We formed a very large technical advisory group, which included Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Social Affairs. And they really had ownership of this program going forward. They helped with sign-off, development, contextualization of materials. They helped for us getting access, getting buy-in across the different community and school structures. And this was integral going forward. And this is an accountability mechanism as well. And we have to report back to them on a quarterly basis within that. We'll also be prepared to compromise. And this was perhaps the biggest learning thing for me as well. So scalable norm change interventions are an exercise in balance. A scalable multi-level social norm change intervention almost sounds like a bit of an oxymoron, but it's possible. At many points in implementation, the team had to weigh up the simplicity and flexibility necessary for scale-up against the depth of content required for genuine normative change. Thanks.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre. Next up, we have the wonderful opportunity to bring in one of the top voices in the UK. And I'm very excited to hear about Ali Matu's work in FGM and ending violence against women and girls.
Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. And I'm not going to be as constructive as Jean-Pierre, but I'll try and stay within the framework. Project ACE essentially was founded in sort of bringing the invisible to the visible, making sure that the recipients, customers, stakeholders, whatever title you'd want to give, particularly women like myself who were survivors and in some cases victims of FGM, into sort of the discourse. So Project ACE was founded on those merits, that we are women, we are girls, and we are present, we're here. And unfortunately, in designing programs around gender norms, by itself, it's excluded, excluding many groups like ourselves. So Project A was about bringing people together and understanding and making the links, which is often not so much deliberately ignoring, but it's just the structure of these things. They're very male-orientated, misogynized, and patriarchal. So it's about removing all of these obstacles in talking about gender norms, and particularly gender-based violence, which FGM is. So using voices within, I mean, I'm not a sort of a global partner, but I'm a community-based activist. So for me, the word I tend to use is making this relevant on the shop floor. And I used a narrative the other day. Often you go into a shopping center, you want to buy a dress, and you walk through the door, the assistant is there, what can I do for you? That is, for me, the translation I'm trying to get to the audience and perhaps hopefully make some leeway. FGM is practiced, as we all know, worldwide. It's a global issue affecting the health of women and adolescent girls in particular. In some cases, very little children, very little young baby girls are cut before they even reach adolescence. So it's important for us to draw. It's a deep-rooted tradition stemming back millennia, predates Islam and Christianity. So you can see how far sometimes when designing programs where we have to go to sort of demystify what essentially is gender-based violence. It's documented in many countries around the world, and we're beginning to see, because we've created these safe spaces, allowing women to come into the discussion, allowing excluded communities. I'm very pleased to hear of the feminism international assistance policy, and I think with Canada leading in that sort of space, there is a possibility we might just achieve the SDG Goal 5, and hopefully, which would be my dream, that we somehow come to ending FGM by 2030. So it's a quite an achievable step, but might take us some time. So according to the World Health Organization, obviously, there are many other categories, but we look mainly at the 4 main types of FGM. I'm not so much sort of aware of the kind of prevalence or the communities in Canada affected by FGM. So I would go mainly to my sort of experience. I'm originally from Sierra Leone, but grew up in London. And so in London, obviously, by the demography, we have a lot of communities from Asia, from Africa, from the Middle East affected by FGM. So it's quite a huge number of women accessing health service. And so by that, I'm going to use sort of the types. So type 1, which is usually the removal of the clitoris. I'm going to go a little bit light on the definition, because I'm talking to perhaps the converted already, so I don't need to go into, as you said, the room is full of health experts. So I won't be going, I'm the sort of the patient talking to the doctor. So type 1 is usually the total or partial removal of the clitoris. Type 2, which is excision, which is usually totally or partial removal of the inner and external lips of the genitalia. And type 3, which sometimes could involve 1 and 2, but it's usually bringing the closure of the genitalia or the opening of the genitalia, closing it, and just leaving a tiny hole opening for women. So you can imagine, in terms of maternal health, the aspect around women and girls' health, delivering babies will be a problem. So it's important for us to look into the impact and the complications that practices such as FGM has on women's bodies. And type 4, unfortunately, has no other sort of category to be put, but it nonetheless has an impact on the health of women. So in countries like Uganda, where they do the pulling, you'd have elongated lips of the vagina, or the lips of the vagina, or the genitalia, which can cause things like cancer, which can cause difficulty in having sexual intercourse. So talking about sexual health, reproductive rights could be an issue for young girls, not knowing what their rights are, because these practices tend to happen to children much younger, maybe perhaps age 6 and above, before puberty, before adolescent. So it's important for us to include those groups of excluded groups in the discourse. So that is type 4. And for some of us in the West, and perhaps in Canada, you probably be more familiar with what we call the designer vaginas. There's a massive growth worldwide at the moment, which I don't sort of understand, the medicalization of FGM. I think it sends a very wrong message, because I was on the Commonwealth the other day, and somebody was saying, well, it's done in a hospital and it's done by a doctor. Does that not make it safe? Well, then, if you try and tell that to my grandmother, who was a cutter, she would say, well, I wasn't trained in a Western kind of way, but I could do FGM safely. And you then begin to ask, this is sending a narrative about making gender-based violence very acceptable. Why must we take part of our bodies off? It is not required, according to what the World Health Organization is stating. So then you hear from women, often in our setting, we have lots of community-based workshops, because again, we're trying to move away from this global discussion, which by itself sometimes do not go to the people it's designed for, because the language used is so far removed and the context used could be very intimidating. So we use generalized language, localized language, by starting to make women understand it's about your health, your reproductive rights, and that you make a place in the society. So women will tell you the general sort of, I know we have several categories listed on there, but the main one that often stands out, and so was in my case, I come from a middle-class family, and my grandmother, who had been married off at age 12, had my dad probably when she was like 15, thought by marrying to another rich family, the money will stay in the family. Unfortunately, if anybody knows London, where I grew up in Tottenham, where we are almost by default riot every day, you're not going to find a rich guy. No. Perhaps in Canada, Ottawa, maybe. I'm going today, so no chance. So what we do know, obviously, about FGMC is that it has no health benefits. Often, similar terms that are used to make health look better is what our communities tell us, is what our families tell us. Oh, it's going to make you feel clean. It's going to make you look a better woman. You're telling a 6-year-old she would be a better woman. So the gender norms are already being formed at a very young age in the minds and sort of ideals of a young girl. And it sort of causes issues from then on, and reinforcing harmful traditional practices from an early age. We do know globally 200 million women are living with the consequences of FGM. It is estimated around the world, somewhere around the world, every 6 minutes a girl undergoes FGM. So it's growing by number, as we're seeing other countries are coming on board. It's a gross violation of a woman and a girl's right. So it's important for us when designing programs, and I'm particularly interested in the Beyond 2020 agenda, and looking how that fits within the framework of the SDGs 2030. And I think, like I said earlier, there's a possibility, because in some parts of the world, many countries, in fact, have sort of outlawed FGM. And more recent, so countries like Nigeria, the Gambia, have put in laws banning FGM. But unfortunately, even with the bans, because when designing the laws, the main recipient of these laws were never consulted, were never brought into the discussion around this issue. So we still find traditional birth attendants, for example. So it's important when designing programs around maternal health that these stakeholders are trained about the risks associated with FGM, because often they're the perpetrators, if I use that word, in terms of the banning and outlawing of FGM, to know that this is also causing issues for women in the long term, and girls for that matter. So what we do know that works from a community-based perspective, and obviously broadening the understanding of gender norms and gender-based violence, it's important to have different aspect, different perspective, changing the narrative a little bit by empowering those that are in receipt of the transformation that we're looking for. So it's important to have a multi-sectorial approach to it. In fact, in the UK, not so much myself, but a lot of survivors were adamant and reluctant to say to the government, we would be sort of left behind. We had to be part and parcel of the change that the government wanted to see. So we were demanding for our needs to be met, particularly in my case, it was more so my mental health. So we can't talk about FGM being a physical detriment to my health and not looking at the psychological impact and domestic violence and everything else that encapsulates is important for us to understand. And so engaging young people, they're the drivers of change. And we have seen from Patrick yesterday and a lot of the discussion. I went bowling for the first time yesterday and I did knock out, how many balls? Quite a few? Yeah, I like balls. Just because we talk about vaginas all the time. So it's important by building the allies with boys, men and boys. It's so important because in the spaces where the discussion around FGM takes place, I'm glad we have about 4 or 5 men in the room. I would like you all to stand up because you, as of today, are now my he for she heroes. And I like to acknowledge that because often we have room full of women. The men don't want to come in. Oh, it's a woman's issue. What am I going to be talking about vagina for? I said, come into the room because in many cases, FGM is done to the girl child or the woman because of you. So you want to know that you're actually touching a real vagina and not something that's been removed. And so you need to fight for that woman's place in society, that this is a violation of your right as a man and the right of your future partner, if we use that word. So again, reinforcing, engaging, and innovative ways in getting policymakers is crucial, that we think of creative ways of talking about the rights around gender norms and gender-based violence, and hopefully having comprehensive training, because sometimes I was shocked to discover in the United Kingdom, a lot of our general practitioners, doctors, GPs, haven't done anatomy. When I say the full anatomy, so you find yourself actually telling the doctor in your surgery or consultation what FGM is. They have no idea. A lot of the time, we're speaking to also practitioners that perhaps may have what I would describe as perceptions of norms that are acceptable or come from communities where social norms, gender-based violence is acceptable. So we have to find a place where we retrain every practitioner and professionals about these issues. And so it's crucial that we do that. But enough of me talking, because I think we'll have to encourage yourselves to ask a lot of questions. But for me, I'm quite impressed with CamWash and thank them for inviting me, because when I applied to put my case across, which I usually do, I find myself going to, and so I say to the Global South, global partners, international NGOs, sometimes you have to go outside of the conference room, perhaps down the road, the alleyway, into maybe the local coffee shop. Find out what's happening sort of in the community, because this will only be relevant when the recipient, the customer, the stakeholder, women and girls like ourselves, adolescent girls in particular, young men and boys, to get that transformative change when it comes to addressing gender norms and gender-based violence. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I'm happy to hear that there is some optimism for 2030.
I'm very optimistic. I'm an optimistic person.
Good.
Because I have to activate to get it right.
Yeah, and we'll hear from you very soon if you agree or disagree with being optimistic and how these approaches that both our panelists are taking. So the first piece that I want to touch on is this intergenerational piece. So both of you are working with youth and people across all ages, it sounds like, in different stages of life and with different experiences. So I want to start with you, Jean-Pierre. and talk about how in your work with Save the Children, you are working in this space of intergenerational approaches. And how do you do that?
Yes, I mean, as I had spoken about earlier, a little bit of that, it's integral to be able to work within the household to establish those intergenerational bonds. It's difficult. So we've had success with really having long, rigorous consultation periods, really trying to be evaluative, really trying to identify key people within the communities that can help us map out best approaches, how to involve the men. The male participation piece is difficult. Men aren't vampires. They don't disappear during the day. They're somewhere. So it's being able to reach out and be able to work with them and to be able to put that forward. So finding appropriate places perhaps where the males do congregate and being able to make those linkages. And unfortunately, sometimes there is an incentivizing piece within that. I guess I know from my own age, when I was an adolescent or a very young adolescent, attending a lot of these type of programs, for me it was church, going to these church group things. I had every excuse under the sun, So really trying to see how do we bring these very young adolescents into these classes, and how do we incentivize parents and stuff to come along with them and to be able to really bridge that divide. We've had a lot of success with trying to work through existing groups. So perhaps working through in northern Nigeria, we're working with imams through the local mosque structures, trying to see if it's appropriate to work with, perhaps if we can't work with unmarried adolescent girls, perhaps we can work with married adolescent girls, and that's where we can start to form that bond. So it might come a little bit later than ideally where we identify it in the structure, but there's still an opportunity or window of opportunity to work there.
Yeah, great. Anything to add, Alimatu?
Jean-Pierre has covered it most. Leave no one behind and bringing the invisible to the visible with intergenerational and intersectionality. Often we don't even mention disabled women with FGM or affected by gender-based violence, domestic abuse, sexual abuse, trafficking, exploitation. And in the UK recently, we had to sort of lobby with the government to place FGM sort of under the umbrella of radicalization, because there are communities with strong views as to why they want to continue with gender-based violence within their communities. So taking extreme views, so bringing communities sort of to the law enforcement, like you said, faith leaders, because again, in these spheres and spaces, these discussions are taking place, and bringing young and old, because a lot of the time, in so many of the communities where FGM is practiced, the notion of the child is not meant to be heard, only adults speak. I mean, we do that all the time. We speak for our children, but sometimes it's important to hear from a child's perspective what their views are around these issues and about people making decisions for themselves. And so it's important to bring everybody. In the UK, the word we use is FGM. It's a safeguarding issue. It's child abuse, and therefore everybody's concern and everybody's business. And so that makes it possible for us to bring groups that are, in some cases, I mean, just the other day I was talking to British Transport Police. They've got nothing to do with FGM, they think. However, we do know, because of the impact of mental health on women traumatized by gender-based violence, most commit suicide, and in the UK, in London in particular, a lot of suicide take place on the London transport. So we had to bring them on board, even though they thought they had no connection. So we're making those links that actually you could be part of the change makers that we're looking for, and identifying those individual groups.
That's incredibly interesting. I think that I love that idea of making the invisible visible. I feel like a lot of our work is about that, and so it's very interesting to hear how you're approaching that in a very, very practical way. So my next question is about innovations. I would really want to hear how, what you think, what innovations are necessary. And I think you've had a chance to hear, hopefully, the Canadian context, Alimatu, and you're working with Save the Children Canada, Jean-Pierre. What are the silos that need to be broken in order to really move the needle in getting to gender equality? By 2030 and beyond that, we need to be innovative. We understand that we need to get off that business as usual mentality. And so how are you doing that in your work? And what do you feel like are those barriers in innovation that we need to move out of? Jean-Pierre, do you want to give it a stab?
Sure. I mean, I think from an innovative point of view, we've really tried to identify these age and life stage approaches. So saying, what works perhaps in rural Rwanda might not work in Kinshasa, like urban DRC, and really saying, okay, perhaps we're working with 10 to 14-year-olds and 15 to 18-year-olds, but perhaps in northern Nigeria we need to work with married adolescent girls and unmarried adolescent girls and have separate curriculums for each of them. Perhaps in Mozambique we need to work with in-school adolescents and then identify out-school adolescents with separate curriculums, separate approaches that work with both of them. As far as silos to be broken down, I mean, I think with us we're really finding that it's really trying to build stronger integration, trying to have stronger integrated approaches, trying to work across Ministry of Education. I mean, coming from a health point of view, the Ministry of Education has always been a harder nut to crack. But I find that working with education is very important because once you get access to schools, you can really integrate those curriculums. So instead of doing health information sessions and trying to do these community mobilization sessions, you can actually have a piece of curriculum that is integrated into the school system and can be taken forward and can be adapted and revised in years to come. You can have a steering group that takes ownership of it moving forward. And from a health practitioner, that's very exciting. That's very important. So those are the type of silos I like to see broken down.
Great. Alibatu?
Indeed, and incredible ones too. In the case of gender-based violence, and obviously including FGM and child and early forced marriages, by the virtue of these harmful traditional practices, they're hidden. You've got to go look for them. You can't obviously look at them. FGM is not visible to everybody to see. So you have to create ways, safe spaces, for women to come together and talk about what's very of a concern. Refugees, for example, where women fleeing domestic abuse can have what I would describe as holistic approaches to them. The doctors should be there, a social worker, a teacher, perhaps a faith leader or a church linked to an institution. And we have to take, these are social norms, so therefore the social well-being of our fabric, which means the communities have to be part and parcel of that, and ensuring that everybody understands the impact when we don't do anything, when we ignore the signs of not addressing issues just such as gender-based violence, in my case FGM. It has carried on for far too long, and it's embarrassing to say in 2018 we are still, a friend of mine, Emma Bates, who talks about everyday sexualization of children, that we take sexualization of women and girls as if it was something so irrelevant. But it's relevant. Just look at the Me Too movement. I mean, I'm very happy an actress in Hollywood or someone in Hollywood is taking on this drive. But there has been women crying about rape and sexual gender-based violence for years. We don't need a Hollywood movement to drive change. Ordinary women across the world are being affected in conflict, are affected in the home. Again, who's talking about the home? Who's representing the home? Who's the leader of the home? Who's the global change partner in a home? These communities are excluded in our discussion. So have innovative ways, making the conversation more broadened, including social media, for example. The hashtag, obviously, yes, you have the trolls, and I just say, just put the hand and they'll disappear. And making opportunities available. In my case, funding is a big issue because I am not funded. It's just I'm driven by my passion, enthusiasm, and I don't want to wait for another woman or a girl. It took me 22 years to talk about my experiences, to even access help. That's how long it took. So it can take a long time. Yes, we accept that. But let's try and at least reach to the women before it's too late, which is what the leave no one behind. So we can create innovative. I was moved yesterday because a lot of technology being talked about and not looking at investing in girls, education, incorporate sexual reproductive rights as a module in a lot of these classrooms that we're doing. Training traditional birth attendants about the importance of delivering babies safely. You would not want to have a baby delivered if somebody has, for example, type 3 FGM. It's going to be difficult for that woman. Put in place things to address mental health issues, because again, the onset of that could lead on to other things. So you have to think of innovative ways of addressing these issues.
Yeah. Okay, so now it's time to open up the discussion with you. So if you do have any questions, comments, do you agree? Do you disagree? I see some of you standing up already, so do feel free to line up. There's one microphone there and one over there. And let's hear from you. Let's start this conversation. Let's go with our first question.
Great. Hi, Shane Green, Grand Challenges Canada. One of the men in the room. Very happy to be here.
He for she.
He for she. Absolutely right. I was thrilled to hear, I mean, speaking of making invisible visible, I'm thrilled to hear mental health part of the discussion. Wonder if each of you could say a little bit more about how, in fact, that features into your work, whether it's mental health of women experiencing violations of their sexual and reproductive health and rights, you know, inclusive but not limited to gender-based violence, improvements, gains that can be made in mental health through addressing or promoting sexual and reproductive health and rights, and what you think needs to be done at that intersection.
Sure. Well, mental health is a big issue, and in some cases when it comes to gender-based violence, it's very difficult for someone to go into a setting. Say, for example, I don't know, what's your line of work?
So I'm the director of programs at GCC, so we have programs in MNCH, we have programs in mental health, so
in
very
design,
much at that nexus.
Yeah, so in designing programs, for example, women come into, say, a drop-in center at Senegal, looking mainly for, say, maternal health. A woman could suffer, we all know, post-traumatic stress disorder from being traumatized by FGM or rape in conflict or domestic abuse and other forms of violence. So in making consultation with that woman, what we say to programmers like yourself or policymakers like yourself is to incorporate some form of dialogue where a woman's needs are assessed, holistic needs are assessed, which would include her mental health, her physical health, her psychological impact, the relevance of the impact that has on her unborn child if pregnant, and on sort of children-independent household, because we know mental health extends even further when unchecked or undiagnosed. In my case, 22 years for me to even have the first diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, and I'd already had 3 children. And no one understood why I was having all these issues, because it never was relevant, because the link were not made. So it's a bringing the dialogue to the recipient before it's even raised, because they will appreciate it coming from the programmers, the grassroots advocates, the global health partners, raising the dialogue, because it's difficult for a woman to say this is what's happened, and even men sometimes. We do have men that are calling themselves FGM survivors because they see their partner struggle with these conditions because it's kept within the home. So it's bringing that out of the home into an open space, but safe to talk about.
Yeah.
Have I answered your question?
Absolutely. I mean, and Jean-Pierre, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I just want to, and I think you covered it very sufficiently, but I just want to say from a program point of view, there's this understanding that as far as doing an SGB response, it can no longer just be this piecemeal approach where we say, we're strengthening SGB referrals, because mental health is a large part of that, but that's also a large can of worms to open up. You can't just train a facilitator to do mental health response and expect them to do it properly. You have to look at the full approach. So are we, okay, we've got the biomedical side. Are we doing the post-exposure prophylaxis, the antibiotics, the birth control? Are we offering legal assistance? And then the mental health component comes into it. So really identifying strong partners that are trained that can do that properly. I shudder when I think of like certain mental health components done in SBG response where a peer educator or like a community health worker has to take on this component without sufficient training, has maybe gone through a 3-day training. And I think that's not good enough, and I think that's an investment we have to make if we want to take it seriously.
Yeah. Great. Thank you both.
Yeah. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Let's take the next one.
Thank you both. My name is Beth Payne. I'm from the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. First, my question is more for Jean-Pierre, but first I just wanted to appreciate Ali Madhu for your words around the designer vagina issue. I've been trying to articulate why I am have a problem with that practice here in Canada for a long time, but I've really struggled with the language around it, and linking it to normalized or medicalized gender-based violence is brilliant and beautiful, and I'm going to use that if that's okay. So thank you. I'm a postdoctoral fellow, and I'm more of a monitoring and evaluation and technical person myself. So my question is around that aspect of your program, Jean-Pierre. How did you measure success in your pilot? You didn't speak specifically about that, and how do you try to monitor normative change?
Yeah, so I gave a very watered-down, simplistic breakdown in 8 minutes, and no, that's a really good question. I think so. Initially, the way this implementation phase was set out for the project, it's a multi-year project feeding to the Passages project, which is this larger research body. The initial pilot phase, or the learning lab, they called it, ran in 40 schools. I think it worked with around 4,000 adolescents. So it was quite intense. There was a large qualitative evaluation that was done with it, and really is vigorous, just reflective processes built into it. But measuring normative change is difficult, and it's something that we're going to come out and say it. It's something that coming from the pilot, I can't say we have had any successes yet. We're able to see where it didn't work, right? So up front, the easy wins, like, are we reaching who we want to be reaching? Are we reaching the same individuals over and over? Are we reaching a reflective group of the community? Are we reaching the most vulnerable, the hardest to reach? And if we aren't, it's really going back to the drawing board and trying to reassess that. There is a large research agenda that has been set out that I'd love to share with you as well, and it's quite in depth. But I think having a large research partner on board has been quite beneficial as well. And it is a question that I do put out, of this upstream approach, this way of trying to say, can we reach them before these norms are set in this really developmental stage? Will this have a difference down the line of toxic male gender norms being developed? I'd like to hope to think so, and we'd like to make the investment to be able to prove that it is so. And I think that the way it's being set out, this research is being done in different contexts and in different countries, so we can kind of isolate those different barriers that we might think might be specific to certain areas. But again, from measuring the social norms point of view, I'm not properly answering your question, but it is something that we're struggling with. Yeah.
Thank you. Anything to add?
Having a long-term view to it, rather than these short-term programs to address long-term issues. But if we invest in the long term, we would have transformative and normative change would occur because of the social norms element. And in our case, it's evident, it shows, but obviously it's investing time and energy and a lot of work. You would see the change. Yeah.
Thank you. One more question over there. Oh, sorry, I couldn't see you from here. Please go ahead.
Sure. I just wanted to appreciate Alimatu as well, especially for us linking, what's happening with the Global South with respect to FGM, and then also, in our context, because often we think of it as not happening or not, not really addressing it, in our context. And I can just remember from work with, refugees and immigrants, school boards not being able to deal with Somali girls, who were missing school and not understanding why, or health practitioners who never delivered a baby, with a woman who had experienced FGM. So thank you, because I think those connections are really important, because it helps us understand that it's an issue that we deal with here, right? So my question, though, is in some of our community dialogues in the countries where we're working, like Mozambique, for example, how do you counter the arguments around the fact that FGM is situated within a context of, rites of passage and this, this transition from, childhood to adulthood, and the counter arguments that, communities will continue to do it because they don't want their girls to be ostracized. There's an in-group, out-group element too. So how do you counter those arguments? Because they do come up, when we're designing our work.
Thank you. Just due to time, because we are running out, I'm going to take 2 and 3, and then we'll address them all, if that's okay. So please go ahead, and then we'll take your question.
All right, Stuart Davidson with Tula Foundation. Firstly, I just wanted to thank all three of you for the discussion. I actually had two quick questions. I don't think they're too in-depth. But the first one is for Alimatu. I'm just curious, in the context of the UK, if you've seen that these practices, FGM, is reinforced more by men or boys or women and girls, or if maybe it's equal. The second question is for Jean-Pierre, and it's just in terms of the program design. You had mentioned that the adolescents meet in the health center, and I'm curious if there was a discussion had on whether that was an appropriate place to have meetings with adolescents, just because for our work in Guatemala, we've been hearing that adolescents and young people are hesitant to go to health centers because it means they're either sick or they're looking for family planning methods. And so there's a bit of stigma around meeting in those locations. So I'm just curious to hear if that was discussed or thought about.
Thank you for that. And our last question.
Hi, I'm Arden. I'm a youth advocate for Plan International Canada. And this is more of a question from the perspective of a kind of future healthcare provider, and it'll probably apply to many of you in the room as well. But if a healthcare professional is performing an exam and comes across a woman who has undergone FGM, what's the best way to respond to that or to initiate a conversation about that in the healthcare setting? Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so are we feeling good to take a stab at those questions? Maybe we can start with Alimatu this time.
Of course. I will take the question from the lady at the far end about the encounters of the communities in Mozambique. Well, countries like Kenya, Tanzania, Eritrea, and I believe Ethiopia are looking into what we call alternative rites of passage, where rather, because the idea is to stop the cutting, because that's where the issue lies. And because in these communities, the reinforcement of culture, tradition, plays a big part. And they would always try and have this, I mean, in my case, Sierra Leone, FGM is highly driven by very powerful women. And they see themselves, in fact, it's called the Bondo Society. Bondo just meaning bonding, coming together. It's the only time women come together and feel that they have a voice, because everywhere else they're not heard. And they make decisions for themselves, they empower themselves. So to see somebody, usually outside of their sort of community, culture, tradition, saying to them, oh, you must stop cutting your girls, it's like, it's unheard of. They look at you as like imposing your views on them or imposing your tradition on them. So it's bringing into that discourse the right alternative rites of passage and say, well, we could do something in place of harming the girls. We could maybe have a bigger party, more possessions, if that would help, and train them about the empowering of women, investing in girls' education, that your girl is better off being more educated. She may find more suitors if she's highly placed in her society because she's the local doctor or the librarian. So it's bringing other aspect to that discussion and not just looking at it from sort of, i.e. the sexual biological organ. She's a girl and therefore could be promiscuous or engage in sex before marriage. But it's looking at the core values that we all have as human beings, that a girl is a value to us as a society, and she could be the future mother of a great leader. So it's putting it in that context, and communities automatically will get it and will buy into the idea of having something alternative. And even the cutters will say, I actually didn't like doing it, but communities come to me, they beg me to carry out the initiation. And so what we say to those traditional cutters is have something in place of that and exchange things in some places. The next question was about...
in the UK,
in the UK,
reinforcing
the, yes, we come across that a lot of the time from sort of new migrants coming into the UK, because in so many ways, obviously tying into gender norms, tying into cultural practices and identity. In some cases, FGM is almost like an identity. What makes me a woman is what a child is being told from an early age. And men, obviously, gives them that power. In some communities, the patriarchal, the misogynized view of what these gender norms are reinforces those views. So they come to the UK thinking this will help me because I've lost everything else. I've lost my home. I'm not going to go back, because I don't know if you all know about the UK immigration policy. Just goes on and on. For 20 years, people could be waiting for their asylum claims to be accepted. And so they think, well, this is not going to be good for me. Who is she going to marry? And so that silent, hidden arrangements begin to creep in. So it's about educating young boys, even in UK schools now. We're talking to younger boys about sort of what we use. In fact, it's our approach to sex and gender. Obviously, when we talk of gender, we usually talk about the sexual biological organ, but gender means all of us. Trans, LGBT are included in that discussion. Yeah. So again, intersectionality plays a big part in how we address your concerns. Future health.
Sorry, Alimatu, I think I'm going to give it 30 seconds, 30 to a minute for Jean-Pierre to address any questions that he might have. And then we can continue this conversation at lunch. Hopefully, if you do have more questions, feel free to address the speakers afterwards.
Yep. I was going to quickly say, no, we always do a youth participation piece when trying to identify where would be appropriate spots. And I probably swallowed my tongue when I was speaking. But we don't actually meet at the health centers. It's more we do health center visits to break down the stigma of what is inside a health center, because many of these youth wouldn't have been to one up until that time. But we certainly wouldn't use that space for the meetings in this context. Yeah. So I hope that's sufficient. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That was a very quick round of answers. Apologies that we ran out of time. Please join me in thanking our speakers, Alimatu and Jean-Pierre. And I do encourage you to come at them at lunch and throughout the conference. Thank you very much for joining us.